Well, you know, I feel honored to be on the same panel with a colleague who is doing such fascinating research. Thank you so much for that talk, Benham. And allow me to tell you my own, sort of my own experience. My husband, about more than 10 years ago, he had what's called a mild grand seizure. So it's just a one-time epileptic seizure, which fortunately doesn't happen again, but it's extremely common. And my biggest frustration, I think we talked to maybe 4 or 5 neurologists while he was in the hospital and the follow-up and after that. And we would ask, what are the chances of this happening again? And we got everything from, oh, it's the same probability of recurrence as the general population, to, oh, it might be drinking alcohol that could cause this or something, these risk factors. And so then he's like, I think for more than a year, he didn't take a single glass of wine. And it's, it just struck me as you're talking, and it's this general theme of this conference about, technology and the interdisciplinarity. These doctors don't have the training to answer this question. And you need someone who understands Granger causality and these things and that, plus the engineering. So I appreciated that talk. So most of my research is about actually cost and quality of hospital care. But I was looking at, sort of what was described in terms of our session. And so it seemed appropriate that I talk about gene therapy, genomics. And so I collected a bunch of different studies, throughout the several months in preparing for this talk. And then I spent Thanksgiving weekend trying to sort of figure out, okay, how do I put this all together in a talk? So I hope it's more than you would gather from this approach. I have to believe that I have some sort of comparative advantage as an economist relative to you. So let's see what you think of what I'm going to say. So background in terms of where we are in terms of healthcare expenditures. This blue line right here is total expenditures on healthcare, and you can see with the y-axis over on the other side, we're close to $4 trillion in spending on healthcare in this country per year, and the red line, you don't have to make too much about how it's bumping up and down. Just know that the growth in healthcare expenditures is positive, and it's well above the growth of the rate of the economy. This last uptick here that we had for 2020 is of course all the COVID expenditures. So everything that Congress and the president signed in was actually COVID. Even housing relief was put in there in terms of those healthcare expenditures. All right, so then one splits this out into the different types of expenditures. So and green is prescription drugs, and we're going to be looking closer at that. And you see, well, gee, it's often the highest. At some points, it is the lowest, but it's the highest. And so I know this figures most into people's thoughts when they're thinking about escalating healthcare costs. It actually turns out that hospital costs are 1/3 of all of all healthcare expenditures. So those are much more important in terms of raising costs. But everyone thinks about drugs, even though they're sort of somewhere between below 15% of all healthcare expenditures. But you do see lots of jumping around, and this is from another presentation I gave a few years ago. But you see, you remember the story of EpiPen. Right, it was a new company acquired it, and they just said, oh, well, we can raise the price, and so they went on and did that, and so there were large increases there, large increases for another drug called Daraprim. So these drug costs are always figuring into our minds, and so how does this affect the normal, the average U.S. citizen? Well, you see in this graph the growth in average hourly earnings that we have in our country for our workers, and then you see the cost of prescription drugs, and the drugs are always increasing at a faster rate than people's earnings, so it's become an extremely troubling, challenging part of healthcare affordability that we have in this country. So now switching over to gene therapy, this is taken, Prime Therapeutics sort of gave the data from these. These are different various gene therapies that have been introduced just recently. It's a relatively new technology. And you can see this Zolgensma, it's sort of, we're talking a one-time treatment. It's a one-time treatment, but it's $2 million, okay? And then Luxturna, not far below that, talking about a little less than $1 million for a treatment. Luxturna, let's see, I think this was for, these are two relatively rare conditions. Luxturna is for a type of retinal dystrophy, decaying away, and Zolgensma is one for something spinal muscular atrophy, and it affects young children. Okay, so see, these are not common illnesses. And so extraordinarily high prices, and you might think, wow, you know, thank goodness I have health insurance through my employer, and they're going to eat the costs for this for me. Now, just keep in mind, Rice University, just like most large employers, self-insures for our insurance. What that means is we pay Aetna to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies and hospitals and doctors for our care, but we actually pay. Rice covers the costs of these medications other than our co-pays and deductibles. So if there's any time one of our colleagues needs one of these medications for their children, we do want them to have access to medications that can be life-transforming or life-saving, but it is you and I. We all spread the costs of these medications out in our premiums, okay? So we pay the cost. It's not as if it just goes poof and the insurer takes care of it. There's a cost to every one of these drugs when we're using them. And so then this is another these are estimates, predictions of how expenditures are going to increase on gene therapy over the coming years, and you can see $27.9 billion, predict that out in 2026. I'm going to show you some numbers from another study that are similar to this, and you're going to get the idea of what is the impact in terms of our expenditures on healthcare. Then the number of cumulative product launches as we go further out, of course, you can see that there's more uncertainty in terms of how many of these are going to actually play out in terms of the make it through the entire clinical trial process and then get FDA approval. But you can see the number of them is growing over time. All right, so add on that even one more medication that came out, and this was reported in the Los Angeles Times. Life-saving drug will cost a record $2.8 million for a one-time treatment. And what is this particular drug? And this is September 9th, 2022. Zynteglo. And this is for a condition called beta thalassemia. It's caused by two damaged genes. So you can see, one thing I learned from these, we're doing gene therapy on fairly simple sort of genetic abnormalities. So this is why we can't have gene therapy for most types of cancers, because they are affecting multiple genes at times. These are conditions where you only have to fix one gene or two genes, okay? So it's a blood disorder. It reduces production of hemoglobin. Because of that, patients need transfusions. At sometimes those transfusions, you have to get them every 2 weeks. And there are 1,500 patients estimated to have this condition in the United States. And the lifetime costs of these transfusions and then the chelation to sort of deal with the iron issues can run as high as $6.4 million, okay? Not every patient, but they're saying some of them, if you don't give them a treatment, they're going to cost $6.4 million instead. So what a drug company, when they're trying to get a $2.8 million drug approved, they're going to tell you, well, this is so much cheaper than what you are doing now, so you should be, falling over yourself to pay for this drug, even at this high price. Okay, so why is it so expensive? This is precision medicine. It's the drug is targeting the unique genetic code of a particular patient with an illness. And my understanding, it's difficult to deliver a working copy of the gene to the cell. I don't think, I took very basic science classes in college, so I apologize. I do love science, though. You know, I love listening to the various different things. And of course, Dr. Matthews teaches me lots of science over at the Baker Institute when I run into trouble. So what you need to do is you need to get a vector to deliver the correct gene to the damaged gene the patient has. And so the best vector, it turns out, seems to be a virus, all right? And so the virus is used as the vector. You remove its original DNA, and then you replace it with the working gene. All right? And believe it or not, I found this graphic on the FDA website, so it makes it, wow, you know, this is sort of, you know, user-friendly for people like me. And so you're taking the healthy gene, you put it inside the virus vector, and then you take this virus vector and deliver it inside the body to cure the patient. Okay, so then, and I had an interesting discussion at lunch with I don't know if she's still here, a PhD student at Baylor. She might have had to, oh, there you are. Hi, thanks. So I was asking, Grace Teets, is that? Yeah. I was asking her, you know, why is this so expensive? So to me, it's just, you know, I don't understand why this is expensive. You know, we just made a whole bunch of brand new, you know, COVID vaccines with a new type of technology, mRNA, you know, and the doses are about $35 each. So why does this have to be $2.8 million? So, you know, this is what I found from a gentleman who runs a company called Berkeley Lights. And he is saying that these viral vectors, this is what makes this different from, say, mRNA technology. There's not enough manufacturing capacity in the world to serve anything but rare, ultra-rare diseases because of the production process. And so their company is working on these stable adeno-associated viral and lentiviral vector producer cell lines that will dramatically improve the efficiency of gene therapy. And maybe we can have a discussion, and someone can correct me on this, you know, sort of after in Q&A in terms of why this particular process is so expensive. You know, Grace was telling me, well, because you're working in a BSL-3 type of environment, so you've got all those particular costs. And so dealing with a virus to start with could make this much more expensive. But there could be much more in terms of the science. And to me, why this is important is because we don't want this therapy to continue to be $2.8 million, right? And so for the economist, I want to know what the production function is. Can we alter the production function so that this becomes less expensive so that we can actually adopt these technologies without all of us going broke, which we probably already feel like we are already in terms of the health insurance premiums that we're paying. And so just to give you an analogy, this is a slide that I found in terms of the cost of solar power over time. So this is over the past 10 years. This red line here is the price of, you know, the price elasticity from solar, price of electricity from solar declined from $359 per, I don't know, what is that, kilowatt hour? Something like that? In 2009, down to $40 in 2019. So I'm not an engineer or a scientist to be able to predict how we get there, but this is the type of decline in cost that we really want to try and get for gene therapy. And I don't know, maybe like gene testing is an analogy, because my understanding that genetic testing has dropped in cost per unit over time as well. So this is the question, can we get there? And that's something that I don't know the answer to. All right, so other people, this is this paper is taken from the National Bureau of Economic Research. So if you go to nber.org, and you're on campus, the Fondren Library pays for this, and you can access this paper for free. This is estimating the financial impact of gene therapy in the United States. And it's written by some really top people. And I thought it was interesting. I don't know all the people on this, but John Gruber is an economist at MIT. He was one of the people behind a lot of the different type of economic prescriptions in the Affordable Care Act. So very top public finance professor. Rina Conti is the expert on pharmacoeconomics in this group. And Andrew Lowe is actually, I think he's in the finance department at MIT. So they got a really broad group of people who worked on this particular paper, okay? And I sort of just summarize their results. We empirically assessed the potential financial impact of future gene therapies. We looked at 109 late-stage gene therapy clinical trials that are currently underway. The results of our simulation suggested total expected of little over 1 million patients being treated by gene therapy from January 2020 to December 2034. So this is going out 10 years beyond those other numbers that I showed you earlier. The expected peak annual spending on these therapies is $25.3 billion, and the expected total spending from January 2020 to December 2034 is $306 billion. Okay, so to give you some perspective, annual spending, remember, in the United States on all of healthcare is $4 trillion. All right, the amount we spent on prescription drugs at retail outlets in 2020 was $350 billion. So that is cumulative amount spent, but that's only for the stuff that's in the pipeline now. All right, and you can imagine that there are going to be more technologies on the way that are going to be quite expensive as well. So this is a table taken from this NBER working paper where what they're doing for each of these, and look, this is the Zynteglo, the beta thalassemia, and what I'd like you to look at, well, they had a lower price. This is what inflation does to you, right? And so I want you to look at this right-hand column, though, and this is the expected change in the QALY. And I'm going to talk about what that is in a minute. They're saying the expected change in the QALY is 4.58. And so it's essentially what's that saying is if you administer this to patients with beta thalassemia, the expected change in the quality adjusted life year on average per patient is 4.58. Okay, and some of these are higher. Zolgensma has the largest, 20.56. All right, so what is this expected change in the quality adjusted life years? So essentially, a QALY is, it's a number that lies between 0 and 1, and it's literally what it is, a quality adjusted life year. So if you are in perfect health for an entire year, your QALY is 1. And then if you're anything less than that, but you're alive, then it's going to be something between 0 and 1. So you could say chronic cough and insomnia is 0.5, and maybe living in a wheelchair is 0.25. We don't really know. I'm just throwing these numbers out. Okay, and so I think it's helpful to actually do an example. So there are many different ways that I don't know, clinicians, I guess, clinicians and health services researchers elicit QALYs. They try and measure them in different ways. And so one of them is the time trade-off. And so respondents choose between living for a particular number of years with a health state before dying, or living for a shorter amount of time in perfect health. And that shorter amount of time divided by their time living with the disease is your measure of your QALY. Okay, so you hear this and I'm like, oh, I have no idea what that means. What did she say? So let's try this out. I need a volunteer who is not embarrassed to tell me how old they are now. Okay, how old are you? Pardon? 54. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, I don't need my calculator yet. Okay, we're going to say that average life expectancy, it's actually lower, but let's just go 80. All right, so you have 36 more years of life to live. All right, but unfortunately, you end up with beta thalassemia. All right, so you have 36 years to look ahead of beta thalassemia. From the literature, it's very burdensome therapeutic protocols you have to deal with. All right, you're going to be in the hospital all the time. Because of this, you have major depression and anxiety. This is what these patients are living with. You're stressed out, so you can't even sleep very well. A lot of time it's because in the hospital, and it's terrible sleeping in a hospital. I've been through that. Many of you probably have as well. And because of that, you can't have your current job. You're going to maybe get something else, work from home part-time, and your family is just completely stressed out. All right. So the drug company comes along, and it's Zolgensma. I get them all mixed up, right? And they say, okay, we can give you Zolgensma, but unfortunately, it's developed this terrible side effect that you're in perfect health, but then you're just going to get a massive stroke. And so we can give it to you now, and we think you'll live for 10 years. All right? You'll be in perfect health. You'll be cured of your beta thalassemia, but you have 10 more years of life. Would you rather have that 10 years, or would you rather just live with a beta thalassemia for 36 years?
It's a close call, but I got to figure that medicine's going to be better in another 10 years.
Really?
Yeah, I think I might take my chances with medicine improving.
Okay, what if I said, okay, so we're going to give this to you, and then 10 years, poof. What if I said 5 years, 5 years in perfect health? Would you just live?
I wouldn't have done the 10 either, right? I'm saying I'll take the chronic condition because the medicine will be better.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Sorry, misunderstood that. Okay, all right. What if I go to 15 in perfect health? 20? Okay, so 20 for sure. So 20 for sure. Yeah, okay, so it's somewhere between 50 and 20, and it was, 36. So essentially, if I split the difference, and my math is so horrible, so I'm saying like 17 divided by 36, and that's a 0.47. So that is how we get the QALY for beta thalassemia. We've decided from this that the QALY is 0.47. So now you know where these numbers are coming from, okay? And there's more sophisticated measures. That's just something, sort of easy to do to give you an idea of what's going on here. All right, it turns out that if you compare those prices to the changes in QALYs, expected changes in QALYs in that paper, the prices for existing gene therapy treatments lead to prices, expected changes in QALYs of $101,000 all the way down to $40,000. Okay, so that may not mean much to you, but I can tell you there are a number of treatments that we cover under Medicare and Medicaid or private insurance that are within this range. In other words, we're paying for plenty of stuff that has the same cost per quality adjusted life year, so why wouldn't we pay for the gene therapy as well? On the lower end of that is something like dialysis treatment. We've already agreed that we're giving dialysis treatment to everyone with end-stage renal disease. Okay, then there's more expensive stuff, but it's just within the range. And it turns out even cardiologists are recommending that, we've got sort of more and more advanced lipid-lowering drugs, and they say we should raise the willingness to pay for lipid-lowering drugs to somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 per quality-adjusted life year. Okay? Now, there's a difference, though, because lipid-lowering drugs you take on a daily basis. Well, you know, these injectable ones, you inject them, but you're paying a little bit at a time, all right? And you take it over the entire course of your life. So somehow it's just easier to stomach as opposed to, I'm gonna fork over $2.8 million to the drug company all in one go, okay? And so that's part of the issue that is troubling people, okay? So what people are, you know, some people are proposing, particularly the drug companies who want to make as much money as possible, is maybe you have an installment model. And this makes sense for employer-provided insurance because you go ahead and you develop this condition or your child develops this condition and you get a job with insurance and your employer pays for it and then you say, oh great, it's paid for, and now I've got this job offer at this other place and I'm just gonna jump ship. And so your current employer paid it, you know, and then your future employer doesn't have to pay anything. So maybe it makes sense to have the payments sort of go on from one, you know, from year to year, and then another employer maybe picks that up and then you're, wait a minute, the future employer, boy, if they ever find this out, they're going to like, well, do I really want to hire this person? You know, and so think back, the Affordable Care Act, one of the things we wanted was a mandate for everybody to have health insurance. This is a really good argument for why you should have that. So you don't have this sort of, you know, throw the hot potato around and try and get rid of these patients who unfortunately, because of a genetic condition, have a higher cost than the average population. You know, these are the people we want to actually try and cover. Another thing that the drug manufacturers are trying to get people excited about is outcome-based payment. So in other words, you pay us for the drug, but if it doesn't work, we'll give you a refund. And you know, it's kind of like, well, you know, maybe that sort of makes sense. You should only have to pay it for it works. But you know, there's still this issue. Well, how much do you have to pay if this medication actually works? And to me, that is still quite a problem to deal with. Okay, so what's the right price? That paper that I've showed you assumed that drug makers would be compensated according to the cost per quality their drug provides to the patient, okay? Now, in a competitive market, that's just not how it works. And actually, in competitive markets, healthcare isn't one of them. But in competitive markets, the customer gets much more, gets a much better deal because of something called consumer surplus. And I'll show that to you in a graph in a minute. And there's a paper that was published, this was you know, sort of in the first year of the pandemic, so before we got everything all ironed out. But they said the cost per quality of COVID-19 vaccines was estimated to be $8,200 per quality in the US if each dose was $35, okay? And so does that mean that Moderna and Pfizer should have been allowed to raise the price of their drugs until the point where it was $100,000 per quality adjusted life year? So just because there are cases when we are paying this and we're willing to pay this, it's like, well, gee, they did save the entire world. They're why we are here. That we saved, you could argue it's the most impactful drug. So because it's the most impactful drug, we should all pay more, right? So there is something kind of wrong with this. And it's not, again, it's not the way we work for most of the goods and services that we purchase on a daily basis. And so, so here are the graphs. I don't know, some of you, you know, took introductory economics in college and you're like, oh gosh, you know, these graphs just give me nightmares. But let me just talk you through this. So this is pure competition right here. And under pure competition, you have an intersection of a demand curve and a supply curve. And I've just labeled this marginal MC, which is short for marginal cost, because your costs determine what your supply curve looks like. And you have an equilibrium where the demand curve intersects the supply curve. And then you get a quantity, the equilibrium quantity that is exchanged, and the equilibrium price. What that means in your standard model is your demand curve is sort of the customer's utility, how much well-being they get out of consuming a product or service. And everything on the demand curve that is above the equilibrium price is consumer surplus. That's the stuff, it's like the free, the goodies. It's what we get, and it's why we want free markets. All right, now you move to patented drugs, which is, gene therapy is a patented drug. And so there's one firm that gets monopoly control of the market. Okay, so this demand curve and this supply curve, this is an infinite number of suppliers, lots of little small suppliers who are generating this curve. What happens in monopoly, suddenly one firm faces the entire demand curve, and they're instead looking to maximize profits where marginal revenue, this is the marginal revenue curve, and if you want, you can ask me in Q&A how I get the marginal revenue curve. But the monopolist looks at where the marginal revenue curve intersects your supply curve or your marginal cost curve. And you can see that it is then the equilibrium price and quantity is here. And we've shrunk the consumer surplus, and there's a lower quantity. Because the price is higher, because it's a monopoly, there's a lower amount of the product sold, and it's sold at a higher price. Okay, I'm saying that is not even what the drug companies are doing with gene therapy. They've actually decided, because not only that, we've added insurance on top of this. We've added employer-provided insurance, okay? And so they've just decided, forget the demand curve. We're just going to price up here, all right? And we can charge this price, and the employer is just going to fork over the money, all right? And we're still going to get a decent amount of quantity sold, because the consumer is just paying, I don't know, a $4,000 deductible, and then they have completely inelastic demand, all right? And so this is why we are getting extraordinarily high prices, really for all medications, and in particular for gene therapy medications, because, and they'll sort of justify it by saying, well, but look at your cost per quality adjusted life year, and this is within the bounds of other stuff you're paying for. So if you're willing to pay for that much, then you should pay this much for our medication as well. And so this is how we end up in the dilemma that we're in. Okay? And so why am I saying that? This is a graph of prices, average prescription drug prices in the US compared to, look at all these other countries, all right? So these numbers, it's really saying, compared to the UK, our prices on average are 255% higher. So our prices do not need to be as high as they are, okay? And so what the drug companies will then respond is that, look, because the American customer is paying us all this money, we're plowing it all into research and development so that we can create novel new drugs. So you have to give us this money if you want more of these gene therapy cures, all right? And if you don't, we just don't have the money to make them, okay? So we can discuss that even, during Q&A as well. But that's the story they're saying. Look, I'm willing to admit there is some truth to that, but because when you think about who developed the COVID vaccines, not all of it was American, but a good portion of it was American, right? But then we can say, well, a good portion of it was Tony Fauci, and he's not a multimillionaire. So, you know, there's something running around there as well. All right. So, my belief in this, and did I have this? Yeah. What I would like to say about this is there is another way to compensate pharmaceutical companies for their research and development, because what they'll tell you is, you'll always hear this, it costs us $1 billion to bring a new drug to market because the number of failed drugs that we have to put on trials and then they fail and then we pay for them. You know, just think of Aduhelm and all these, you know, the different Alzheimer's medications that cost so much money. So, you know, you have to give this. So what I would say is, look, that's all fine and good, but you need to give us crystal clear information on how much you spent on R&D, because these companies are not doing that now. It's the same thing. I'm dealing with, I told you I work with hospital prices, and we're just in this constant battle in terms of hospital price transparency. The same thing goes for drug companies. If they could tell us and report their R&D every year, everything that they spent on the failed drugs, all right, then we can take that, we can make calculations in terms of how risky their payoff is, because doing drug discovery is more risky than other stuff. I'm willing to take into a higher risk-return ratio for that. But we could then calculate what is the profit that they need to make in order to encourage them to develop more drugs. And then we can set prices based on a target profit that we want these people to earn. And I guarantee you the prices will be lower than what they're quoting now. Okay? It would just be so much more sensible, all right? The drug companies don't want this because they'd rather have the current system where they make more money. But that's what we should, you know, we're talking about hospital price transparency. We should be talking about pharmaceutical price transparency as well. And it's the transparency in their cost of delivering the R&D. So, you know, gene therapy, it's costly, but the US is reaching its limits on what it can spend on healthcare. We're now up to close to 20% of our economy that is being spent on healthcare. My husband, he's on the faculty, and he was just telling me he attended the benefits committee meeting today. Cost of benefits rose 11% this year. They haven't figured out how much they're passing on to us, but you know, this is the continued escalating increases. And there's so much more that we, of course, you know, that's why we have conferences like this. There's so much more that we could be directing our resources to, as opposed to pharmas and hospitals making high profits. All right? So we can support the innovation that we need to get new drug developments for gene therapy, and hopefully, you know, we'll get this better production function and learning by doing and reduce the costs of making these drugs in the future. But this is really hard just because the upfront costs of gene therapy are so much higher than many of the other medications that we have now. So I would encourage policymakers to be asking for more transparent reporting of R&D costs by pharma. And again, we set the prices at a level where these drug companies will earn a reasonable profit, they will invest, they will do the R&D that will generate us new medications, but not so high that we have unaffordable health care for everybody else. And I'm open to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Vivian. I have two questions about the quality. So maybe there's something I'm not quite understanding, but normally we think about a medical treatment improving quality of life and how long you're going to live. I mean, someone who doesn't take insulin is going to die sooner if they have diabetes. So how did they come up with a measure that turns that into a trade-off? I'm puzzled about that. And the second thing is, it also seems very subjective. You're counting on people making a hypothetical judgment about something, and for something that's factoring in so much into these calculations of cost, that seems to me a fragile way of trying to figure that out. So I just wanted to understand that better.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good questions. So even though, so what I'm doing in terms, that example I gave you, all I was saying is just give me the value of 1 year spent with beta thalassemia. And then if you know the increased survival from clinical trials, then you say, okay, this person lives for two additional years, and then you multiply that 2 times, 0.47 that we got. So that was only one part. I just gave you the QALY per year, and then your clinical trials can compute their survival. Yeah, and yes, so this is, it's incredibly subjective. And so this is why some people would say, no, don't ask him, because he's never had the disease, right? And so there are all these issues, and the people who work on this, they have lots of discussions about who you ask the question to, how you ask it. And for example, some people just say if you did just a regular scale from 0 to 1 and asked you how you felt, that you would actually end up with an even lower number than that 0.47. Yeah, so it's a science. It's that alone is really hard to do. Amy, I think you
Yeah,
have.
hey, thanks, Vivian. That was really terrific. So pharmaceutical companies are incentivized to develop drugs because they can price them high, but there's also the component of market exclusivity, as you mentioned, through patents and regulatory exclusivity, right? So from an economic perspective, if we limited market exclusivity, which would disincentivize, but we instead had government investment in drug development, would that, have you sort of thought about whether that would allow us to decrease the cost of the drugs and ultimately decrease the cost of healthcare overall? And
Yes.
how do people think about that? I mean, I'm sure that's been in the literature, but how do people think about that?
Yeah, so that's absolutely true, and that's why in Europe the drugs are lower than ours, because what they do is they have a national purchaser. In the UK, it's NICE, I forget what it stands for, National Institute. Anyways, they look at, and they'll actually do the cost per QALY, and they'll say, this is 200,000 per QALY, and we're just not going to cover it. So you can't, and then that forces the drug manufacturer to lower the price, and it's like, well, gee, they're still selling it, so they're still, covering their. I think they'll say, well, we covered our costs in the U.S., and so this is just gravy. But I agree that it's better to have more regulatory intervention, because currently there are all sorts of scams that are going on in terms of if you have a patented drug that's about to go off patent, there's pay for delay, so the generic drug company, if you know the one that's going to come in, and well, in this case it's a biosimilar, and if you know they're coming in, you can pay them not to enter the market. And this stuff goes on all the time, and Department of Justice, FTC are trying to put a stop to it, but the drug companies have the most powerful lobbying. They spend more on lobbying than any other industry, and so that's how they're effective in getting to continue to do this stuff.
But hypothetically, so it's just one quick follow-up. If we had a system where there was limited to no patentability of drugs, right, and we shifted the initial investment in R&D from pharmaceutical companies to government, wouldn't that change the calculus of the overall healthcare spending of the entire ecosystem?
Ah, I see. Yeah, potentially it could, but then you will have people arguing that the government will not be as driven as the private sector to develop these new drugs because there's not so much of a profit motive, and so the entire process might be more inefficient. Yeah.
I thought that was a great talk. I'm not as familiar with the economic aspects of healthcare, but I think it's very interesting to see how there's a trade-off between the costs and the benefits, and then also the R&D. I'm particularly curious with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the effects of that might have been different in terms of the investment in healthcare. I recall from one of your slides, I think in 2021 there was a bump up in healthcare. One of the statistics, right? And I'm curious whether As a result of this increase in perhaps investment as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw not only more science or development or reduction in costs in vaccines, but also perhaps like tangentially related things such as you said, viral vector therapies, because we're developing like an mRNA related vaccine. Maybe does that increase the cost of those or decrease the cost of those? Are there any associations with regards to that?
Oh, so yeah, boy, there's a lot that is in there. Yeah, so my guess is that the development of mRNA vaccines was accelerated dramatically, and you know, we never developed a vaccine this quickly. You know, it's in record time. So that's very exciting. So I think we're going to get a bump in terms of mRNA vaccines and the numbers of diseases they're going to cure. What the implication is for costs, I'm not so sure. I'm more excited about that because that's not sort of $1 million per treatment, but let's be hopeful that actually leads to a lot of, you know, economists aren't just about controlling costs. We actually value things that improve quality of life and well-being. And so if we get a lot of increase in human well-being for lower cost, that's a great deal as well.
Yeah, thank you. I had another question with regards to your second point here, where we kind of want perhaps governmental regulation to set levels such that you know, there's less inelastic demand as a result of, for example, insurance companies. Is there a quantitative measure to compare, for example, two different companies and their profit margins versus R&D kind of development and social benefit as a result of that R&D that we can use to compare companies and set a standard level?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, that's exactly what we should have. We should have a study that says, you know, if you increase the profit margin by this much, this is how many additional drugs will be discovered. The problem is, you know, we're not measuring a homogeneous product and the increment. And this is, you know, it's one of the things I worry about, because often we increase, you know, we offer higher returns and then the companies develop one more cholesterol lowering drug, and I'm you know, we have a lot of those. You know, I want something that can cure something that I'm suffering from, you know? And it's it's really hard to get that measure just because there are so many Me Too drugs that are in there as well. So it's hard to do the analysis clearly.
So do you have any suggestions then from a governmental perspective on how they would implement? Oh. Okay, thank you.
Just, yeah, two quick ones. One's a fun question. Excellent talk, by the way. So the fun question is, if we go back to John Kennedy's economic philosophy, that the rising tide lifts all boats, why not just let the pharmaceutical companies push the profit margin up a little bit? They make more profit. They hire more people. They pay their stockholders more dividends. All our retirement accounts benefit. What do you say to this type of economic thinking?
I will say the same thing I told Moshe when we were talking about the Baylor-Rice merger, the notion of opportunity cost. So every additional dollar that we give in profits to the pharmaceutical companies, my guess is we could have spent it on education, housing, food, and got much more return to society than giving a pharmaceutical company an extra dollar of profit.
Okay, thank you. Now the serious question. What is going on now? What are the companies, where are they not transparent with R&D cost?
They don't report it. There's, you know, yeah, no data.
If they reported behind a firewall from Tufts,
Oh, really?
I think it's the best data I found, and it's like if I pay a firewall, I can see some of the things, but they don't report.
Right, and so, you know, they'll report, oh, we spent this much on expenses this year, but then it turns out a bunch of that expenses was marketing. So we literally don't know.
So is this a much lower bar than Rice has to negotiate with the federal government for indirect costs on our grants? Pharmaceutical companies have a lower bar than universities on transparency?
Yeah, that's what lobbying gets you. It's really, you know.
Conclusion, Rice needs to spend more money on lobbying, huh?
Yeah, maybe we wouldn't be paying that tax on our endowment now if we did.
Okay, thank you, Vivian.
Thank you.